Hey there, Agile rabble-rousers and malcontents, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity-Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. If you are watching this on YouTube, you might see that I am wearing this fine shirt produced by Michael Lloyd, an Agile coach over on the other side of the pond, and he has taken common dysfunction and made heavy metal band t-shirts out of all of them. And so they're all really great. Check him out. He's got a little store set up. I don't know the URL. I probably should have looked that up before talking about him. But if you find him on LinkedIn, you can send him a DM or something and he'll tell you. They're cool t-shirts. And he's got some other cool stuff as well, some different things that he does around dysfunction mapping that you should check out. He's a great guy too. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about visualization. Last episode, we talked about creating a visualization of the way work flows through your organization and especially paying attention to your segment of it. How does something go from request to deliverable? And the reason that creating visuals and visualizations of these things is so powerful is because it takes things that are normally invisible and it makes them visible. An analogy that one of my colleagues, Troy Tuttle, shared with me one time that I thought was really good is he goes, when we're talking about knowledge work and, maybe you're walking through a room full of developers or a room full of BAs or whatever, and they're typing away, you really don't know how busy they are. But what if somebody blew up a balloon and put it in their cubicle for every outstanding task that they had? So you could walk by someone's cubicles and some people would have a big pile of balloons, some people would have a little pile of balloons, and you needed something to get done. Well, you would know right away who the best person would be to ask for that, right? Because all of a sudden something that is invisible has become visible. And now that it's visible, it becomes actionable because that information is now radiated to everybody else. So taking invisible things about work and making those things visible has a real power to it. Not only does it cause us to think critically about it, but it also puts those things in a state where multiple people can look at it, talk about it, and make good decisions about it. So today we're going to talk about visualizing the work that's in progress in your system. So last episode, we talked about creating a visualization for your workflow, the whole system from ask to delivery. But now I'm going to talk about what's inside of that. What are the things that are flowing through that system? Normally in Lean or in Agile, we refer to that as work in process or work in progress or WIP for short. And we're going to talk about visualizing that. So how do you go about creating that visualization? Well, first of all, you have to get your arms around what are the things that move through your system. What are those things? Are they bugs? Are they features? Are they user stories? Are they projects? Are they something else altogether, right? So, in manufacturing, we know right away what the items are that are moving through the system because they're always the same, right? You at one machine, you're taking in raw materials, and as it goes from machine to machine, it gets more and more refined, more and more articulated until it comes out the other side as a fully fledged product, right? So we know what the things are that go through our system, and we know how things get from request to deliverable. We can see it happen. We can physically see it happen. That's the edge that manufacturing has over us, along with the fact that their work tends to be more deterministic, is you can see everything about the work process. And so it's very easy to see where problems are. It's very easy to troubleshoot and make optimization suggestions. But for knowledge work, it's very difficult. And so you need to figure out what those work items are. And there's a lot to be said about that. I'll probably do a podcast episode specifically on how to identify those things. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to say that generally speaking, you want these items, I'm going to call them work items. You want them to be the smallest deliverable value at the scale you are trying to visualize, right? So if you're trying to visualize work in progress for your entire organization, then we might be looking at a pretty high level of things, right? The smallest deliverable value at the organizational level is probably at the product level, right? Or very close, or big chunks of the product. Whereas when you start trying to visualize the work maybe for a specific team, then these work items are a much smaller scale, right? They might be user stories or bug fixes or whatever, right? So the work item is going to be the smallest deliverable value at the scale that you happen to be visualizing. So you need to figure out what those things are. What are the items that are going to go in this visualization? And then you begin to shape a useful visual representation of those items and where they are at. Now, first of all, I want to talk about a few things that aren't serving that purpose very well. So the first one is a list, right? Jira by default, for instance, will show things in a list view. A lot of like workflow management systems do that, whether we're talking about like, Monday or Asana, or Jira or any of these kind of workflow management, team management, collaborative kind of systems, they usually default to the list view. I don't think this is a good visualization of work in progress because when you're looking at a list, everything is flattened and you're looking at it in a vertical kind of hierarchy. So the list has a tendency to obscure things, especially towards the bottom, and it's kind of difficult to see where each item is in relationship to all the other items. Yeah, it probably has a status on it or something like that that indicates what stage it's in, but you're looking at it in a vertically flattened hierarchy, which doesn't really reflect your work. And in my opinion, it often obscures how bad things are. It certainly obscures things like bottlenecks, right? Because everything is flattened into that vertical hierarchy. So let's say, QE in staging has item after item after item backing up. Well, if you're just looking at a list and those items are kind of interspersed with other items in the list, you might not get the idea from the visualization that QE and staging is backlogged, right? But you might if you had a different visualization, right? So I'm not saying lists are bad. I'm not saying list views are bad. I'm just saying they're not a great way to visualize your work. If the list is what your team is having conversations around or your organization is having conversations around, I don't think that's optimal. I think you can do better. So let's look at kind of the next thing up the food chain from that, which is the to-do, doing, and done board or chart or whatever. And this is where you have 3 columns. You've got to do, you've got doing and done. All your work items that haven't been done yet are in to do. All the work items that are currently in process are in doing, and then all the ones that you've completed are in done. This is a pretty popular thing for Scrum teams to do with their items. It's become so popular that it even sort of becomes a huge misunderstanding when people talk about Kanban. I have read articles from organizations that really ought to know better, most of them making software to manage software development teams' workflow, come right out and say, Kanban is when you have these 3 columns, to do, doing, and done, and you move items through the columns. Like that is Kanban, those specific columns. That particular visualization can be useful when you are talking about very different kinds of items that don't share a common workflow at all. So for instance, when I'm keeping track of my tasks at home, so I might have to mow the lawn and I might have to pay my electric bill. Those are 2 very different workflows, right? There's no workflow I could map out that would be cogent for both of those items. But the thing that unites them is they can be to do, doing, and done. So I use those 3 columns for my stuff at home because those work items are all over the map, right? Like what other stages would I map out for paying an electric bill that would be the same as mowing the lawn? Nothing, right? Maybe preparation or something, I don't know. But so to do, doing, and done works really well in those situations. But it's not a great visualization for getting good information about how your workflow is working because, again, it's such a high level of abstraction. So many things are obscured. Either you haven't started them yet, or they're done, or they're in progress. But a lot of things happen in that in progress, right? Most things are going to be in progress. They're going to be in the doing column and they're going to hang out there for a long time. So how do you really get a good visual of where the challenges are, right? Or how do you really know what state a given work item is in? Are you still writing code for this item? Are we still gathering requirements for this item? Is this item ready to go to production? All that goes into the doing column, right? So you're really not getting the intelligence that you need to really, A, know where things are truly at, and B, be able to spot issues because a great multitude of sins are covereth up by the doing column. I'm positive I said that correctly. Everybody who's familiar with older English, you know that I nailed that. Anyway, you might expect me at this point to start talking about Kanban boards, especially if you've listened to me for very long, or you know me at all, or you run into me at a bus stop. You will know that I like Kanban and I like Kanban boards. I do like these, but I'm not going to tell you to go out and make a Kanban board per se, or at least the kind of thing that you have in your head, maybe, when you're thinking about a Kanban board. So if you've seen a Kanban board before, you know you have columns, right? And each column represents some stage of your workflow. And then the work items get mapped to those columns. They're going to be in some column or another. It's really like to do, doing, and done, except it's much more finely grained than that. Those columns are more specific, right? So you might have a column for gathering requirements, and requirements are done waiting for development, and developers are developing. That's another column, right? And developers are done, and now this is waiting for UAT to pick it up, and UAT is going on, and now this is ready. So now we're going to put it in staging and run all of our tests there, and if all those are good, then it's going to deploy to production. Like those could potentially all be columns on a Kanban board. So when you map your work items to those columns, you get a pretty good idea of exactly where things are, and you also get a pretty good idea of which stages are under the most stress right now, right? So I use Kanban boards for lots of things, not just software development, but all my teams, that's our go-to, is making a Kanban board that looks like what I described in some form or fashion. Every client we work for, their workflow process to get to production is a little different. So the boards may look a little different from client to client, but that's the basic idea. You know, when you're developing software, you have an item that someone asked for, you have to understand it better. Once you've got a pretty decent level of understanding, you start writing tests, and then you start writing code. And then once you've got code written, you're a little more aggressive with, are we sure we've covered all the scenarios? Are we sure everything is behaving like we're supposed to? Until we get it to a point where we feel like it is shippable, right? And then usually there's something else. Somebody besides us takes a look at it, gives us feedback on it, and then eventually it gets ready to be deployed, and then it gets to be deployed. Most software development workflows map somehow like that, but they map specifically very differently. I love those boards. However, it's important to note that even in Kanban, creating a board like what I just described is not required, which is interesting, right? Because usually the Kanban board is the iconic thing people think about when they think about Kanban, but Kanban doesn't actually require you to create a board, or at least not a board that looks like that. It requires you to create a visualization of your workflow. So I've worked with teams before where when we've talked about their workflow, it made more sense to make a board that looked a little bit more like Chutes and Ladders or Candyland, because at some point in the process, the workflow items diverged, went to different teams or different people, and then they came back together, right? So we'll make boards that mimic that process. There was one team I worked with where every person was sort of a separate contributor. They all had their own specialty that they brought to the team, kind of like the A team, except they're still going. And they would all make contributions that eventually would come together in the middle and form Voltron. It formed the completed product, right? And so we made a board for them that looked like a target, right? And around the target, you had the individuals, and they would send work items toward the center of the target, and they would move through those stages to get to the bullseye. And then when all their items were in the bullseye, they had a product to release, right? So it's about creating the best visualization for your workflow. And that's why I'm hesitant to tell you make a Kanban board, because at least the traditional way we think about Kanban boards, it may or may not be the best way to map what you're actually doing. And you might get a little bit more creative than that, right? You might have to go outside of those linear columns. You may have different things that happen in parallel that are kind of hard to map with linear columns, right? So feel the freedom to do that. But whatever you do, and like I said, I use the traditional Kanban board structure for almost everything. I've yet to come across very many teams that couldn't use that, but I have come across some. So I like them. But this is where you also want to make sure that when you're mapping out this workflow, you're not just capturing the stages where things happen, you are also capturing the stages where things aren't happening. This is really important, right? So think about this. Let's say you have an organization, maybe they're structured a little bit more traditionally in their software development. So you've got a group of BAs that gather the requirements and then write them in some form. And then those requirements are ready to be built. And so the BAs are done, but the coders haven't started coding yet. They pull that thing to code when they have the capacity to do so. So there's this time period where the requirements are done. It's ready for the next group to do their transformation to it, but it's waiting, right? That needs to be in your map as well. In fact, that may be probably in terms of optimization, it may be one of the most critical parts of your map, because let me tell you, the lifespan of a lot of work items includes quite a bit of time where nobody is doing anything with it. In most organizations, when we go through this exercise, we find that 40 to 50 to 60% of a work item's total delivery time was just sitting around waiting for someone to do something, okay, because there wasn't capacity. Map that, visualize that. There will also be other things like that that you may want to visualize. I'll give you one example. Not going to name names because this is a very big organization here in Kansas City and they will come after me and kill me. But I went to work with some of their teams and we had a Kanban board, and this one particular team had a manager that would keep telling them to stop working on whatever they were working on and work on this new set of priorities. You know, I was in a urinal next to the CEO and I'm pretty sure he said something like we should prioritize these other things. So stop what you're doing and do these other things. One time within a 2-week period, he changed the team's direction 5 times. So all those things that were in progress just kind of got, not scrapped forever, but at least scrapped for the time being. So on our board, I made a little square in the lower left-hand corner and drew a little trash can on it. And I'm like, okay, everything he scraps, we're going to put in this corner. And sure enough, as things began to pile up in the trash, there were many more things in the trash than ended up in the done column, and eventually even more items in the trash that were in progress in the whole system. So that was something we also wanted to capture about the workflow. It was a factor, doesn't fit nicely and neatly into a Kanban board, but we wanted to visualize it. We wanted to make that invisible thing visible so that we could all see it happening and we could talk about it and we could come up with ideas about it and we could see how big of a problem that was. So when you're thinking about your map, don't just think about the happy path. Don't just think about a highly productive, highly efficient workflow. Think about the stuff that happens and stick it in your map, right? Visualize it. Then you take your work items and you put them in the appropriate stages based on where those work items are at right now. And I personally find this is a seismic culture shock. Just the act of mapping the work that is currently in progress, stuff that people have started but isn't done yet, and mapping those to those workflow stages is a stunner for all parties concerned. I have never done this exercise with an organization and not had people's jaw drop at how many things they have going at once that aren't getting done yet. It surprises everybody. And this is the power of visualizing it, right? When it's just on a list or when it's in some dev's inbox or something like that, you don't really see the big picture, right? But when you put it on this map, you do, and it's scary. There was one organization that I was with, and one of their developers pointed out, we have more active projects than we have software developers. Just let that sink in for a minute. Not even we have more items in progress than we have developers. We have more active software projects than we have developers. That's an amazing amount of overload, right? That's staggering. And an amazing amount of dead time that things are just going to sit around, because obviously these developers can't be working on all these projects at once. They can't. It's physically impossible, right? So this is a huge culture shock. It's stunning to them to see how much work is in progress, and it is equally stunning to see how many work items are in some kind of waiting state, right? How many of them, the requirements are done, but development hasn't been able to pick it up yet, or development's done, but it hasn't been able to be deployed yet, or my personal favorite, this PR is waiting on a review. Just looking at where those things are. Look at how many things are waiting for a PR to get approved. It's a lot, right? So these are important things to map out. And once you do, you will clearly see the impact of how your workflow stages progress on your work that's in progress. And you might be surprised to find that a good chunk of the slowness of your teams is not because your people are slow. They may be lightning fast, but your system, man, your system's just not going to accommodate it. It is just overloaded and nobody can get stuff through. It's like a traffic jam on the highway. You're just not going to move very much. I don't care how fast your car can go, right? And that's what is happening in your workflow. You will probably see that happening. However, the flip side of that coin is, weirdly enough, once it's in front of you, it relieves a lot of psychological pressure, because a lot of times people know in their bodies that they have too much going on. They've got too much on their plates. And so they stress about it, and they worry about it, and they fret about it. And they're worried, like, am I going to make this deadline? Is this thing going to be done on time? Oh, I have these 5 other things I have to worry about, And then, of course, they got stuff at home too, and things like that. I'm a single dad, and believe me, like, trying to keep all that stuff straight with all the stuff at work, if all I've got is it in my head, it can be very stressful. It can be overwhelming, and things are going to fall through the cracks. But once you get it out of your head and onto a map, all of a sudden, it just doesn't seem that scary anymore. Like, yeah, it might look bad. There might be a lot of stuff in progress, but now you've got your arms around it, right? Now you can track it. Now you can watch it happen, and it's out of your brain and onto a second brain, right? Where people can look at it, and you can start to manage it. And then it just doesn't seem as overwhelming, right? Like, yeah, we can just attack these things as we have capacity, and we'll knock these things out. So usually at this point, people are curious then about WIP limits. Maybe you've heard of those, right? Kanban has WIP limits. People talk about limiting WIP in Agile and Lean discussions. We'll get to that. We're not going to get to that today. We will get to that. We'll do an episode just on that. Like, how do you do that? What are good techniques around setting WIP limits and using WIP limits to your advantage? We will talk about that, but don't worry about that today. Today, I want you to worry about the map. I want you to get the map. I want you to get the work items on the map. Just get your arms around what the current state is, and you will find probably that there's a lot of it. So all I want you to worry about is just getting the water levels down. Okay. Don't worry about WIP limits. Just look at what you got going on and just start getting it to come down. Look at all the things that are in progress and talk with your teams and be like, what is it about this item that still needs to be done before it gets done with a capital D, right? Why isn't it done yet? Sometimes they're working on it and work still needs to be done. Sometimes there's a blocker. Sometimes another manager has hijacked your developers to do something special for them that isn't common knowledge to anybody else. Sometimes it can be a manager rapidly shifting priorities, right? Sometimes it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. If you're in management, that's quite possible. Sometimes it's managers like yourself who, when they hear something is important, immediately assign it to somebody, right? Sometimes your work and your approach to it is just not efficient. It's just not the best way you could be going about it, and that's why your water levels are so high. But there's no point in me talking to you about that right now. What's important right now is to get a picture of what it looks like, because once you get your workflow map up, and once you get your work items that are in progress in the right places, and you can see a picture of what's going on, then you are going to be in a great position to start looking at where you need to focus your management time. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.